Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. It's May 23rd, 2024. Joel Chasnoff here, coming to you from Israel. I just returned pretty much just about 12 hours ago. It's 4 in the morning here, which means, yeah, it's exactly 12 hours since I landed. But don't worry, I'm up. I'm over the jet lag. Or maybe I'm so extremely jet lagged that I feel completely awake. No harm in being up at this hour to do this. And I really am happy to share everything, all my insights with you from just being back in Israel this short time. It's not a long time that I've been back, like I said, about 12 hours, but it's long enough to be able to perceive that things do feel a little bit different here, at least since I left 2.5 weeks ago for this leg of the tour. And we'll talk about all of that tonight. Tonight's title is Three Truths and a Lie. I mentioned that in the newsletter I sent out yesterday, that would be the theme of tonight's episode. And in a minute, I will get to that theme and explain what that title means and what exactly we're going to explore. Before we do, though, I just want to give you a little bit of an insight into what's going on here in Ra'anana, in our part of town, because there is a sad story that I do need to share. Our neighbor's son was killed in Gaza 3 days ago. To be clear, we don't know this neighbor. We're not on a first name basis. They live in an apartment building around the corner. So it's literally less than a minute walk from our building to their building. But we got the news a couple days ago. When I say we, I mean the entire Jewish community. Anyone who follows Israel knows. We got the news that 3 soldiers had been killed in Gaza. And as I've told you, there is sort of a protocol that here in Israel, when you find out a soldier has been killed, you immediately look at the name and then you look at the city where he or she is from. And I noticed that one of the soldiers was from Ra'anana. And this is not the first time this has happened. I don't have an exact number, but I would guess that this is probably the sixth or seventh soldier from Ra'anana who has been killed. And anytime a soldier is killed in most towns, but certainly in Ra'anana, there's also a protocol for what happens next. There is a procession from the soldier's house or apartment, and that procession starts with a military vehicle. The coffin is inside that vehicle, and it drives through the streets of the town. And in this case, because this soldier lives literally around the corner from us, the procession drove past our apartment. That's the first time this has happened. And then this procession drives through the main street, which is Ahuza, all the way to the military cemetery. And depending on the background of the family and the choice of the family, often the family and friends will walk behind this military van that's holding the coffin. And in this case, there were 100, maybe more people walking behind the military hearse. And it's a harrowing experience every time it happens. I was not there. I was still on the plane on the way to Ra'anana when the procession happened. But my wife stood out on the street and she said she just broke down crying, and everyone around her was just bawling as the procession drove by. I also want to point out that our apartment is directly across the street from an elementary school. And the older students from the elementary school also came out and stood on the sidewalk to pay their respects as the hearse and the family and mourners walked by. And this might be what strikes me the most about this story, that elementary school here in Israel goes through sixth grade. So middle school is seventh, eighth, ninth, high school 10th, 11th, 12th. So you had fifth and sixth graders. I mean, think of how young that is. Fifth and sixth graders standing out on the sidewalk in silence, watching a hearse go by. And in that hearse is the coffin of a soldier from an army that they are going to join in a matter of years. And if we do the math, I would say, 6, 7 years. These kids who are out on the sidewalk watching the procession are themselves going to join the IDF. So that's a little insight that I want to share with you from, what's on the ground here in Ra'anana. We can't begin tonight without mentioning that. And also this apartment, I drove by it yesterday once I did get here. And you see sort of typical things that happen when a house is in mourning here in Ra'anana since this war has begun. There's a tent set up in the parking lot of the building, and the reason there's a tent is because so many people come to pay their respects and sit, for the family sitting Shiva, that the apartments aren't big enough to hold everyone. So they set up a tent with chairs to keep people out of the heat. It's been 90 plus degrees here in Israel this week. And so there's a tent to keep people out of the heat and to do the minyan when they do the services. And there's also signs up directing people what the hours of Shiva are. And I certainly plan to go and make a Shiva call. Again, I don't know this family personally, but that's just what people do here. It's when a soldier in your neighborhood, God forbid, is killed, you go and make a Shiva call. And I also want to point out this is a French family, and I know for certain that this is at least the third French soldier who has been killed since the Gaza war began. It could from Ra'anana, just from Ra'anana. And just to give a little background, more and more French people are moving to Israel in general, but to two towns in particular. One is Netanya, and the other is Ra'anana. What I've heard is that there's a rabbi, a well-known rabbi from Paris, who moved to Ra'anana, and simply all those who follow him and respect him are moving here as well. Now, why are so many French moving to Israel? It's different from the reason Americans and Canadians have typically moved to Israel. Typically, Americans, Canadians move out of Zionist reasons, but a sense of belonging, that lifelong dream to live in the Jewish homeland. For the French, it's really an aliyah of necessity, what we call, and also for the South Africans who are moving here. It's a feeling that there is no future for the Jewish community in France, in South Africa. And so you have these large waves of French and South African Jews moving to Israel and specifically to Ra'anana. And this is at least the third French soldier who has been killed. The most recent soldier before this who'd been killed probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And this is someone who my wife Dorit actually knows the mother of this soldier. They too are French. And so I don't know. It's made me think that these are people, who move to Israel because they feel they're not safe in France. And now here they are burying their children as they grow up and join the army and then are killed in Gaza. So wanted to share that with you before we actually dove into the meat of this week's podcast. All right. So as I said, this week, the title is Three Truths and a Lie. And what I really wanted to do here is examine, there's so much being said about Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. A lot of words flying around, some of it rumor, some of it fact. And what I wanted to do was examine four of the statements commonly said about Prime Minister Netanyahu and examine whether I think they're truthful or not. And as you can tell by the title, I believe that three are true, but one is actually not true. I want to reiterate that I'm not a political scientist. I'm not an expert on the government or the IDF or even what happened specifically on October 7th down to the nittiest grittiest detail or what's happening in Gaza now. But I do speak for not just my own voice, but for the voice of a lot of people that I'm in touch with here in Israel. Now, everyone's in their own bubble. I'm in a certain bubble, and you can talk to someone in a different part of the country that's in their own bubble. So you'll never get the one opinion that speaks for everyone. But I do think that given the swath of people I'm in touch with and who my chevre, my friendship circle is, I speak for a lot of people when I share these opinions. Okay, so let's look at number one. The first statement is that Bibi Netanyahu is to blame for October 7th. I actually believe that this is true. Many people, obviously, many institutions have responsibility, but at the end of the day, I do believe that Netanyahu is responsible for what happened on October 7th, and a lot of people do. And here's why. It's not simply the idea that the buck stops here and that when you're prime minister, ultimately the responsibility is on your shoulders. Certainly, that's part of it. But it really is much more specific than that. Yesterday, the Israeli army, the IDF, announced and released documents to prove it that Netanyahu had been warned by the army 4 separate times, that on 4 separate occasions, the IDF warned Netanyahu between March 2023 and early October 2023 that the judicial overhaul proposal that he was inciting, that he was pushing forward in Israel, was causing major social upheaval in the country that threatened Israel's security and was leading our enemies to think that this was a prime time to attack. So let's just say that again. 4 separate occasions, the IDF warned Netanyahu that judicial reform directly threatened Israel's security and was leading our enemies to possibly attack. And he ignored all 4 of these warnings, clearly. Now, Netanyahu yesterday denied this and said that he was not warned. However, we know this is a lie. We know this is not true. The reason this is not true, we know, is that Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, came out publicly last summer and said he pretty much implored Netanyahu to stop the judicial reform and said publicly that it is threatening Israel's security. And he was fired for doing so. Netanyahu fired Yoav Gallant for speaking out against him. Now, there was such an uproar in Israel that you would fire the minister of defense, the man who is charged with knowing the defense situation more than anyone else, that you would fire him for speaking the truth, that Netanyahu actually did reinstate Yoav Gallant. And Yoav Gallant now is the defense minister and once again called out Netanyahu last week, saying that we need a day after plan, that the lack of a day after plan is once again threatening Israel's security. But the point here is that on 4 separate occasions, Netanyahu was warned by the IDF and he ignored them. Now, on top of that, we have to look at the fact of since 2005, that's when Israel pulled out of Gaza unilaterally. Since 2005, which is 19 years, Netanyahu has been the prime minister for the vast majority of those years. And so any intelligence collecting related to Gaza, any policies related to Hamas in Gaza, those are Netanyahu's policies. He can't just say, I was elected to office 2 years ago and I'm inheriting the policies of someone else. Netanyahu has been the prime minister for the vast majority of the time that Hamas has been in power and that Israel has been out of Gaza. And so all the failures of intelligence to know what was happening with these tunnels, the major thought was that these tunnels were being dug in order to attack Israel from inside of Israeli territory. But it turns out this tunnel network was being dug really to set up an underground Gaza where Hamas could function, hold hostages, operate. All the lack of intelligence, the fact that we didn't know that, that's on his shoulders. Also, the funding, millions and millions of dollars have gone to Gaza, to Hamas in Gaza, and this was a Netanyahu policy. Netanyahu approved the transfers of funds from Qatar to Hamas in Gaza. Not just approved it, but suggested it. He was in favor of it because his belief that a strong Hamas meant a weaker Palestinian Authority. And if you know Netanyahu, the one thing he is most staunchly against is any kind of Palestinian state. And so he'll pretty much do anything to prevent that. And building up Hamas in Gaza through funding is another one of his policies. All of this money, by the way, went to building this extensive tunnel network under Gaza, not to building up the Gazan society. So this really is on Netanyahu's shoulders. And so that's the truth. When people say that October 7th is ultimately Bibi's responsibility, I agree with that. I think that is the truth. Now, I also want to make clear that the IDF had some major failings, and we've learned a lot that the chain of command and the hierarchy in the IDF is broken. Everyone expects that the current chief of staff, Halevi, will step down at some point. There have been, numerous reports that I've mentioned before on this podcast about how Israeli intelligence actually had evidence that Hamas was planning something, but it just never worked its way up the chain of command. And so we were vastly unprepared for October 7th the way we should have been. But at the end of the day, it is Netanyahu, I believe, who is responsible. All right, that's number one. Number two, There's a lot of talk right now that we are losing the war in Gaza, or that the war in Gaza is not going as well as it could have slash should have. And I agree with this, specifically the second part. I wouldn't say that we are losing the war in Gaza, but I do believe that the war is not going as well as it could have or should. And there's a few reasons. First of all, if you were to ask the soldiers on the ground, they would not agree with me. Okay. If you ask soldiers coming back from Gaza, most of them would say that we are kicking Hamas's ass and that we are, if you simply look numerically, 14,000 Hamas militants killed, more injured and taken out of the sphere of battle compared with 300, less than 300 IDF soldiers killed. And again, I hate to put a number on our killed in action as if they're simply a numeral, but if you are comparing numbers, we have vastly far fewer killed. And soldiers are saying that they're no match. The Hamas really has no strategy, that they just come out of tunnels and they fire, but the IDF operates like a true military, and that we are the stronger power and that we are defeating them. So that's what the soldiers are saying. But if you look at the larger goal, I don't think there's any way to look at this war and say that this war is going as we had planned or as we'd expected. First of all, let's start with the major goals. There really were two major goals of the war. One was to destroy Hamas and their ability to attack again, including the killing or taking prisoner of their leadership. And the other major goal is the release of the hostages. And now, nearly 8 months in, neither of those goals have been met. I don't think anyone thought, everyone knew that this would be a long war, that this would not be overnight, but I don't think anyone thought that this would be 8 months in. We would still be in Gaza, still with the majority of hostages, over 50%, not released. And in that sense, the war has not gone as planned. Um, the statistics are saying that probably 50%, 40%, 40% of Hamas militants are still able to fight. 40% of the tunnels are still intact and usable. So in the sense, and certainly the leadership, we know Sinwar is still hiding out, and other senior commanders are still there in Gaza. So to this extent, the IDF has not met its goals for the war. There's also the idea that we really don't know what the end game is, and there is no day after policy, no plan for what comes next. The other angle we have to look at when talking about this war is simply perception. You know, if you had said on October 8th that 8 months from now, Israel would twice have been brought to trial at the International Court of Justice, that there would be arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court for Prime Minister Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, that the United States, our strongest ally, would be calling us out in public for not sending in enough humanitarian aid and blaming us, that they would hold back shipments of necessary arms, um, and that protests around the world would be not only erupting, but would be regular. Uh, I don't think anyone would have believed that. But here we are, 8 months in, and that is the situation. So just the perception of where Israel is on the world stage, certainly this war has not gone as well as planned. So I do have to agree with that. I would not say that the war is a failure. I wouldn't say that we have lost the war by any means, but it hasn't gone as planned. And there's really no way to argue that one when you have more than half the hostages still there and Hamas still fighting us and Hamas's leadership intact. Okay. Statement number 3. Netanyahu is putting his own political needs before the well-being of the country. I think this is absolutely true. I think almost all Israelis agree with this one. It is pretty much impossible to argue with this. First of all, no day after plan. Netanyahu has still not issued any kind of plan for what happens after we defeat Hamas. And the reason is political. Here's why. What the Minister of Defense is saying, Yoav Gallant, and what the two former chiefs of staff who are in the war cabinet are saying, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, what they are saying, and these are trusted people that are respected in Israel, is that there needs to be some sort of Palestinian leadership to fill the vacuum that right now, if we are defeating Hamas in certain neighborhoods of Gaza, we need to then fill that vacuum. And that vacuum needs to be filled with some sort of leadership from the Palestinian side, either a reformed PA or some sort of board or community of technocrats who are overseen by the international community. I mean, it's complicated, but we need to fill these vacuums. And the vacuums are not being filled. And the reason is that Netanyahu's right-wing extremists in his coalition, specifically Smotrich and Ben Gvir and that part of the coalition, do not want to see any Palestinian leadership in Gaza. They want to resettle Gaza. They want Israel to take over Gaza and put settlers back in and have the Israeli army oversee it and have Israeli government ruling over Gaza. That is what they want. And Netanyahu knows that if he publicly says that there should be some sort of Palestinian authority in the West Bank, that the far right wing edge of his coalition will leave the coalition, the government will collapse, and Netanyahu will no longer have the mandate. He'll no longer be prime minister. So he is literally, I believe, harming the country by not implementing some sort of day after plan because he wants to remain in power. He's also ignoring what everyone knows has to be the eventual end game here, which is some sort of Palestinian state. We need to separate from the Palestinians. We don't need to be friends with them. It doesn't need to be a warm and friendly peace, but we need separation. And he is completely ignoring that possibility, and I think ultimately harming Israel for not even saying, not even coming out loud and saying we're not ready for a Palestinian state yet, but eventually we need that. I think a wise and responsible leader would say that eventually we need to have some sort of Palestinian state just so Israel can have its own security and be separate, but he's not even willing to say that. We also have an opportunity now for normalization with Saudi Arabia, and it seems that Netanyahu is not interested in that as well. So again, these long-term policies, which would help Israel in the long run, maybe we're not ready for them now, but in the long run would make the country healthier. Netanyahu is not interested in pursuing these. And I think for that reason, he's really putting his political desires and needs ahead of the well-being of the country. So number 4, were it not for Bibi, the hostages would be home. Or that Netanyahu is deliberately sabotaging the hostage talks. And whereas those other 3 statements I think are true, this one I am not inclined to think is as true as the others. The hostage talks, I don't think they're nearly as black and white as we might want to believe. I think we've seen over and over that Hamas really has no interest in having any kind of deal that releases the hostages for various reasons. I think Hamas, when it comes to the young women, they do not want the world to see what they have done to our young women. You know, it's pretty much assumed that we are reaching the point now where some of these young women who have been held hostage in Gaza could be giving birth. And it's assumed that some of them are pregnant and will be giving birth. We're going to talk about that more in a second in the news segment of the podcast. So Hamas doesn't want the world to see that. I think Hamas also literally doesn't know where all the hostages are. As I've mentioned before on Inside Israel, some of the hostages were taken by Hamas, but others were taken by Islamic Jihad. Others were taken simply by armed Gazans who entered Gaza on the 7th and took hostages as their own souvenirs, as their own loot. And so I don't think Hamas even knows where all the hostages are. They've never provided a list of the names of hostages. They've never provided access to the Red Cross. And so in one sense, I don't think Hamas is even able to do a deal that would release a significant number of hostages. And anytime Israel has proposed and made very generous proposals to Hamas, releasing, hundreds of prisoners from Israeli jails, many of whom have murdered Israeli Jews, Hamas has rejected it. The last proposal that Israel put forward was literally a cut and paste of Hamas's previous demands. We just took their demands and gave them right back to them. And Hamas rejected that deal. So when Hamas, and you can understand why, when Hamas looks around the world and they see that there's arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, and that we're being put on trial at The Hague, and there's protests against Israel, and I mean, why? What motivation do they have? What motivation do they have to make any sort of deal? In that sense, they're winning, and they just want to keep things moving in the same direction they're going now. So I can't necessarily say that we should blame Bibi for this one. I don't think that we have a partner on the other side who's genuinely interested in having any kind of hostage deal. Now, I don't think Netanyahu has been the wisest in his statements. I think when we have negotiators going to Cairo to negotiate what a deal might look like, and Netanyahu publicly says we're going into Rafah no matter what, I think that can undercut the chances of a deal. But I don't think at the end of the day that we would have had a deal had someone else been in power, because really what Hamas wants is the end of the war completely, the IDF to withdraw from Gaza, and the vast majority of the Israeli public, Netanyahu's approval ratings are low, but the vast majority of the Israeli public wants the war to continue and believes that we need to remove Hamas from power. So as long as we're on the topics of hostages, we should ask, well, what should we have done if we were to go back in time? What might we have done differently? I personally think that one of Israel's big mistakes was negotiating for the potential release of hostages in pieces. The idea of first this number of women, and then this number of elderly, and this number of sick. And I think, and many agree with me, that we should have treated all the hostages as one group and given some sort of ultimatum. I think in the 48 hours after October 7th, Netanyahu should have gone on television to the world and said, the reason we might go into Gaza is to rescue our hostages. This is the primary goal. We have grandmothers, we have autistic children, we have young, old. We are going to rescue them. That is the primary purpose of any war. However, before we do, we're going to give a timeline. We're going to give Hamas 48 hours to release all the hostages. And if you do not release all the hostages after 48 hours, then we will go in and crush Gaza. And we should have given that sort of ultimatum so that at least the world knew. And then if they didn't go, we should have gone in and fought Gaza, militant and civilian alike, because we'd already given them a chance and made clear what our goals were. But we didn't do that. Instead, we started negotiating in pieces, and it all blew up and fell apart. And we only had really one release of hostages. And since then, nothing has progressed. And the whole narrative has been that Israel is leveling Gaza and committing genocide instead of Israel is attempting to rescue its own hostages. The hostages are barely spoken about in media outside of Israel. So somehow we have not communicated that well. So those are my three truths and a lie that I wanted to cover this week. Let's move on to news real quick. A lot of news stories came out of Israel this week, so it was a bit difficult to pick only three. But here are the three that I think are the most relevant to the average Israeli on the street. And these aren't necessarily the ones you'll see in the headlines on CNN, but I think for the average Israeli, these are the big news stories. Number one, easily, I think, is the release of this new video. It's about 3 minutes long, showing the abduction of female soldiers on October 7th. This was a huge news story in Israel. This is body cam footage from Hamas. You can see the bloody faces of the female soldiers. You can hear the Hamas militants saying in Arabic, "These are the ones that we can get pregnant." It's part of their strategy. It wasn't just a thought on the spur of the moment. We've since discovered that one of their strategies of Hamas was to rape and was to impregnate those women that they could. That was part of their strategy for October 7th. And we hear them saying this on the video. And what this has done in Israeli society, it's really awakened us again and shaken us to the plight of the hostages and the utter failure of the government to bring them home now, nearly 8 months in. So this release of the video, I think, is the number one news story coming out of Israel this week. Number two is the arrest warrants of Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. This is the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants, not just for Netanyahu and Gallant, but also for Sinwar and other members of the Hamas leadership. And I'll tell you, nothing has united the Israeli public, left, right, center, like the utter disbelief and shock and anger that Netanyahu and Gallant would be issued arrest warrants. Now, Netanyahu's approval rating is low. Israelis do not approve of how Netanyahu is running the war. Like I said before, the majority believe he's running the war based on his own political considerations. However, I don't think any Israeli from any spectrum of society believes that there should be an arrest warrant for Netanyahu and the defense minister Gallant. And even worse, the idea of lumping them together with Sinwar, the head of Hamas, and these brutal, horrific terrorists who kidnap and rape as part of their strategy, who kidnapped infants, that putting them together in the same category, Israelis are horrified, and it's not like we had a lot of shock it's not like we had a lot of faith in the international community before this, but now all the more so. We just feel that it's an absolute joke. The whole International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, The Hague, the UN, Israelis discount this completely. We don't have any respect for these institutions. And yet we're ever more horrified. Even the Attorney General, who's very against Netanyahu here, has come out and said that there's no reason to believe that an arrest warrant is justified for Netanyahu and Gallant. So it really has united the Israeli public in that sense. And the other big news story, it could be that Norway, Ireland, and Spain have said that they are going to recognize a Palestinian state within the next month. I don't think that's actually the biggest news story for Israelis. I think for Israelis, it's what's happening up north. Things are really heating up in Lebanon. More and more people are talking about something very serious happening very soon as Hezbollah continues to fire into northern Israel. The thinking being that the deeper we go into Rafah, the more Hezbollah will think that we are tied up in Rafah in southern Gaza and that there's an opportunity to attack us in the north. So everyone in Israel is really expecting that some sort of war would happen very soon with Hezbollah. And I know you guys see me as the boy who cried war with Hezbollah, but we really do believe it's going to happen sooner rather than later, possibly this summer. But things are heating up in the north, and this is what Israelis are talking about, not the death of the Iranian president, not even that Norway, Ireland, and Spain are recognizing the Palestinians as a state, but what's going on up north. That's the Israeli point of view. All right, let's get to some of your questions for this week. I chose 3 questions. So my friend Harold in Pennsylvania wrote, according to polls, what is Netanyahu's current approval rating and how much longer can he survive in office? Well, those are really 2 separate questions. I had to look hard to find the numbers, and I think the latest poll is from over a week ago. But here's what I found in a few places, that right now, Netanyahu has a 32% approval rating. Now, if you've been following this podcast, you'll know that this is actually higher than it was before. At one point, for a long time, it was 20%. But it turns out that after April 13th, if you remember April 13th, that's the night that Iran attacked Israel, and Israel was able to fend off that attack with some of our partners, including the US, Jordan, France, that after that attack by Iran, Netanyahu's approval rating actually went up a bit. So right now, the poll is showing that Bibi has an approval rating of 32%. Still, this is lower than the approval rating of Benny Gantz, who is at 35%, and many believe that if elections were held now, Gantz would be prime minister. However, what's really interesting in this poll is that who has the highest approval rating of all? It's actually Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, who has, as I mentioned, last summer called out Netanyahu and said, you need to stop the judicial reform because it's harming our security, and who last week gave a press conference saying that without an endgame, you are threatening Israeli security, and implored Netanyahu to fill the vacuums in Gaza with some sort of Palestinian leadership. Yoav Gallant right now is polling at 43%, and that's still less than 50%. So there really is no leader in Israel right now. That might be the biggest takeaway of all, is that there's no one leader that we really trust, that we really have faith in. So that's part of what makes the situation so difficult, is that our soldiers are dying in Gaza, that the war doesn't really have an end in sight, and we don't have a leader that we all have faith in and all trust and believe is telling the truth. But in terms of your question, Harold, those are the numbers. Bibi's at 32%, Gantz at 35%, and Yoav Gallant at 43%. Now, the second part of your question, how long can he survive in office? Right now, I see no indication that Netanyahu will step down or leave office before there are elections in the fall of 2026. There's just it, it doesn't seem viable. He's certainly not going to step down himself. The other way it would happen is if members of his own Likud party were to sort of revolt and realize they don't have a political future by sticking with Netanyahu. But right now, we're not seeing indications that they are willing and interested in doing that. So for the time being, it does seem like Netanyahu is here to stay. Now, we do have an ultimatum. Speaking of ultimatums, which I mentioned before, Benny Gantz said that if by June 8th, there is not some sort of plan for a day after, then Gantz will leave the war cabinet. And if that happens, Netanyahu would still have the majority he needs, but if he's leaving, then Israelis' trust in the war cabinet would really be eroded. So that could be some sort of game changer. So keep June 8th on the calendar. But I'm not seeing it. I just don't see anything, certainly by Rosh Hashanah in the fall, of any change politically here. All right, next question. A number of people wrote in with questions related to this. I'm going to take two of them and combine them. I'll take questions from, this is a question from Susie and Sheila. Is it true that the IDF found 50 tunnel openings to Egypt from under Rafah in Gaza? And did Biden or Netanyahu know that there are 50 tunnels from Gaza directly into Egypt? Is that why Biden and other leaders were panicky that the IDF planned to go into Rafah at all? Could the hostages be in Egypt? The IDF for a long time has suspected that there were tunnels leading from Gaza to Egypt. Actually, not suspected. We knew. And in the past, Egypt has actually blown up some of the tunnels that connected Egypt to Gaza. But we also suspected for a long time that one reason that Egypt was so against the idea of the IDF operating in Rafah was that we would discover tunnels connecting Gaza with Egypt. And indeed, we have. And what this shows is that Egypt really has been complicit with Hamas and Gaza. For all Egypt has been saying about brokering a ceasefire, etc., it turns out that Egypt really has been in cahoots with Hamas. And these tunnels between Egypt and Gaza are what allow ammunition, materials to come into Gaza to build the tunnels, to fire the rockets, the parts for the rocket launchers. This is a main smuggling route, and Egypt has been a part of it. Did Netanyahu know? I would say absolutely. All of Israel knew. Did Biden know? I would imagine that Israeli intelligence, when making their case for the war with the U.S., stated that there were tunnels connecting Egypt and Gaza, and that's why we needed to operate in Rafah. I can't imagine we didn't state that. However, I don't know that Biden necessarily cares. I think right now Biden is so concerned for his own reelection in November that it's just not even on the table what's best for Israel, what's best for Israel, for the U.S.'s ally in the Middle East. I think their election and their own political considerations are the number one factor as driving a lot of the statements coming out of the U.S. So in a way, it might be irrelevant what Biden knew or didn't know. Egypt certainly knew, and Egypt certainly feared that this would be revealed. Um, does the world care? Will it make a difference now that we found out that Egypt has been sort of partnering with Hamas, or at least allowing it? I don't know that how much world opinion would change. I doubt it, right? Uh, you asked Susie and Sheila, could the hostages be in Egypt? Not only the hostages, yes, I think it's possible the hostages are in Egypt. I think it's also possible that Hamas leadership, maybe Sinwar, has fled to Egypt. We don't know where he is. One of the, I think, egregious mistakes Israel has made, and I put this on Netanyahu, is that we've broadcast over and over that we're going into Rafah in southern Gaza. If you remember, I've mentioned before on Inside Israel that the first time I think we made this threat of going into Rafah was before Ramadan. This is March. And we said that if by Ramadan there is no hostage deal, we are going into Rafah. That was 2 months ago. So for 2 months, over and over, Netanyahu has been saying, we're going into Rafah. The Rafah operation is happening, completely removing the element of surprise, completely giving Hamas in Rafah the ability, uncontested, to regroup, to put together a battle plan for fighting Israel when we went in, and also giving them, Hamas, a chance to flee that area altogether, the leadership, and to maybe even move the hostages. We completely gave them this chance of 2 months, a 2 month head start on us. And that is why we're seeing soldiers, I think, now die in Rafah, because a few soldiers died earlier this week in a booby-trapped building. We gave Hamas the chance to go ahead and booby-trap some of these buildings and tunnel shafts and areas they knew that IDF soldiers would be going into, because we broadcast our plans for 2 months without actually taking action. So yes, we knew that there were tunnels connected. The problem is we didn't act on them immediately. And one very common sentiment in Israel among the leadership is that when we went into Gaza in the beginning, we should have seen Gaza as one entity. We should not have divided it up into north, center, and south, which is what we did, saving the south for last, that we should have gone into Rafah from the beginning. All right. Last question. And the last question, I always try to save one that's a little more personal to me or Israel related in general. This question comes from Ruthie, and she said, last week, Joel, you talked about a teenager you met in the US who wants to join the Israeli army after high school or college. My question is, how easy is it for a foreigner to join the Israeli army? Does the army vet who gets to join and who doesn't? Really good question, Ruthie. So, in my book, The 188th Crybaby Brigade, I talked about how surprisingly easy it was to join the IDF. I actually think I had the sentence, it was easier than signing up for a library card, because at least with a library card, you needed to show your driver's license and proof of address. When I joined the IDF, I think I needed a Xeroxed copy of my parents' ketubah, their wedding certificate, to show that I was Jewish, and there was some other paperwork, but it was surprisingly easy to join the IDF. If you are Jewish, the law of return states that you can move to Israel, become an Israeli citizen, make aliyah. That's all you need to become an Israeli citizen. And if you are of the age to get drafted into the IDF will draft you. So it's actually very easy to join the IDF if you are Jewish and of military age. And the second part of your question, does the Army vet who gets to join and who doesn't? That's kind of complicated. I think in recent years, a lot of people have been saying that the Army needs to vet a little more carefully, and I actually agree with this. I think the IDF is very much in love with this idea of the brave young Jew coming from another country to join the Israeli army. It really is the ultimate Jewish experience and the ultimate Israeli experience to become an IDF soldier. And it's a very sexy notion, the lone soldier who leaves the good life in America or wherever else and comes to join the IDF. But what we've been discovering is that not all of these soldiers are actually prepared and ready. I've always believed that there are two types of soldiers, lone soldiers who join the IDF. There are those who grew up with a strong Jewish background, who have good Hebrew, who've been to Israel several times, and who really believe that their life would be incomplete if they didn't serve in the Israeli army, and that for Zionist reasons and Jewish reasons, they want to have this experience. That's the background I came from. My Hebrew was very strong when I joined up. I had a very strong Jewish upbringing, including Schechter, Camp Ramah, hosting Israeli exchange students, many Israel trips before I came. But then there's this other category of lone soldier, and these are often kids who go on birthright, and after their 10-day birthright trip, decide that they want to join the IDF, and they're not ready. They're not ready mentally. They're not ready for the stress and challenge. They are a bit lost in life, and they figure that joining the IDF will give them some purpose and solidify their identity, and they struggle. Sadly, we have seen a number of suicides among lone soldiers over the past 10 years. And one reason is I think that the Army hasn't properly vetted who is psychologically fit to join in the IDF. And I write about this in my book, Israel 201. So I'm hoping the IDF will vet a little more strongly who comes in and who they keep out. I know the idea of the brave young lone soldier is a glorious one, but for everyone's sake, we need to do a better job of making sure that everyone who joins up is actually psychologically fit for the stresses of war. And that's the other mistake I think a lot of lone soldiers make. They think they'll get the uniform, the gun, they'll train, they'll have the army experience. I don't think they actually consider that they could actually go to war. And that makes sense. For a long time, Israel really hasn't had a classic war. But there have been several lone soldiers who have been killed in Gaza. I knew one of them, Jonathan, Zichrono Livracha, who's from upstate New York. And I was going to interview him for Israel 201. In the end, I didn't, but I was in touch with him quite a bit before he went, and he sent me a few voice messages before going into Gaza, and he was really, really scared. And I think he, like a lot of lone soldiers, joined the IDF looking for some purpose, but didn't actually think they could go to war. And we had another lone soldier die last week from Argentina. And so lone soldiers need to consider that this is real. It's not just summer camp with guns. This is real. They could go to war, and their lives could change forever, and possibly they might make the ultimate sacrifice. That has been Inside Israel for tonight, May 23rd, 2024. Join me next week. Next week, we're going to be, again, on Thursday night. That'll be on May 30th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. If you want to get the live link so that you can join these webinars in the future, I just put it in the chat. It's joelchasnoff.com/podcast. That's also where you can find the links to listen to the podcast on Apple and Spotify. And hey, a favor from you, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and rate it on Apple and Spotify. These ratings are what help get the podcast out there. Share them with other people. And if you ever want to see a recording of these, right after we're done, I take the recording and I upload it to joelchasnoff.com/podcast. So within 24 hours, you'll be able to see a recording if you can't make the live broadcast. My website is also the place where you can sign up for my weekly newsletter, Hebrew is Magic, where I dissect Hebrew words and show the life lessons that we can learn in Hebrew. So if you are not currently on that, please go ahead and sign up and join that community as well. Continue to send me your questions. Your questions are what always give this a fresh angle every week. So email those to me at joel@joelchasnoff.com. You can also do that through the website. And again, I will see you next week, Thursday, May 30th, 2024, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll leave the chat open for a few more minutes. And I see we had a lot of questions today. I'm going to go ahead and write down some of these questions and take screenshots so that I can address them in next week's broadcast. Signing off from Israel, where it's almost 5 in the morning, and I just might go back to bed. Thank you so much for joining me. Thrilled to have you part of the community. I'll see you next week. Laila Tov, everyone.